In this video, I'm going to tell you how to paint those great plastic terrain kits quick and easy. It's becoming Fez weather. I love great looking terrain. I'm a little fussy about how my terrain matches on the table. Sometimes if I'm working with a particular manufacturer, like I'm using stuff from Gale Force 9, then I want kind of everything to be Gale Force 9. Or I want, I got some GW stuff, I want everything. Or it's all scratch built. I want it to sort of match. I'm so, like I said, fussy about that kind of stuff. The thing is, I love terrain, I'm a little fussy about terrain, but I don't want to spend tons and tons of time painting the terrain. And secondly, I don't want the terrain to really take away from the models, neither in drawing attention, which I've talked about in the past. One of the reasons why I like to keep my terrain pretty neutral, pachow, but also because the more time you spend on terrain, the less time you got to paint miniatures. So I bought some new terrain recently, a plastic kit from GW, some sort of command battle box, something or other. I'll put a link to it down here in the description and whatnot if you're interested. But it's a bunch of different kits and some pipes, which I didn't build the pipes yet, but I just built a bunch of the different kind of ruined bits and all that kind of stuff. And I started thinking about, well, how am I going to paint them? I know how I usually paint them. And then I thought, well, maybe you'd like to know how I usually paint them. And so, here we are. Step one with nearly any piece of terrain that I generally paint is to prime it black. Now, I sometimes will prime dark brown, especially if I'm doing something that's supposed to be like wood. A lot of the pieces that I did for Warcry that were the wooden kind of palisades or whatever, barricades, all that kind of stuff. Palisades might not be the right word. Anyway, whatever. Those things I primed brown, whereas the stuff that was stone, I primed black. And it just kind of helps to be a good base for the overall color scheme, and then everything you're doing from that is lightening things up. And then any crevices that don't get any paint in them, they become shadows, which I think helps a bunch. So I generally like to use like a Krylon camouflage paint, but I'll also use Rust-Oleum as well. In these shots, I was using Rust-Oleum because I didn't have this can available. But they work pretty much the same. I like them. They don't cross very well, like using the brown from one and then deciding you ran out of that can and then going to grab brown from the other brand. They don't match particularly well. The Krylon, I think, has a better spray doohickey, whereas the Rust-Oleum's is, it's okay. But it still does the job, and it's what I primed all of this terrain in. So yeah, definitely prime that stuff, let it sit outside and outgas for, I don't know, I usually do it for at least overnight so that the propellant smell goes away, and then I bring my, little cool pieces of busted up buildings inside and I start to work. A quick note about why I don't use my airbrush to prime my terrain. I love using my airbrush to prime models. I do it all the time, and I think it gives probably, for me personally, the best results. But for terrain, I generally prefer to use a rattle can, and the reason for it is because generally the stuff that I buy for the rattle can is designed to stick to plastic, and your terrain will take a lot more of a beating on the tabletop than your models will. So I really want the stuff to bind to the plastic. And airbrush paint sticks to plastic, don't get me wrong, but it's not formulated with like a special brand name kind of thing on there to stick to patio furniture. It's designed to be, it's primer, it sticks to whatever you spray it on, but it's not crazy sticking to whatever, the plastic. So I generally like to use, for terrain, rattle can. It just also is a lot quicker. Rattle can back and forth on a bunch of terrain versus using your airbrush on a bunch of terrain just takes a lot less time. And time is, well, it's money, but whatever. I'm just talking about you have to try to get your things done so you can get more things done. All right, so normally the next step is I would then take my airbrush or a rattle can, something like that, and try to find like a mid-tone gray and then spray down. Now, I just said that I don't like to use my airbrush for priming, but for other types of highlighting and all kinds of stuff like that, airbrush is awesome. But you don't have to use it, and you don't even have to use a rattle can to get this mid-gray. What I did to get the mid-gray on these folks is I just took makeup brushes, and I just started dry brushing the mid-gray. In this situation, it was this color here from Army Painter, but you can use whatever kind of mid-color gray you like. And you just put it onto your dry brush, and you dry brush and wipe it off on the piece of paper like one does, and then you start working. Now, the thing is that this terrain has got a lot of deep recesses. So when you have some sort of terrain that has a lot of deep recesses, you might actually want to use a smaller makeup brush to do this step. It will take longer. but you will be able to get it into all the crevices and the weird little panel lines and stuff like that you have all over your GW crazy 40K terrain a little bit easier. If you're talking about something that's more of a stone wall or something like that, then you could probably use a fatter makeup brush. But get yourself some makeup brushes, get yourself a middle tone gray, and just start scrubbing on it. You generally want to get it into as many nooks and crannies as possible, and going back and forth is just fine. In some situations, and like in the next step, you kind of want to go one direction when you are using your dry brushing, but for this step, you're just trying to get it to go from black to mostly gray with some black down deep in the crevices. So scrubbing back and forth is a really good idea to get it into all the places you need to get it in, and then let it sit for a bit so it can dry. Now we're going to do the highlighting, and this is the point where you start taking, again, whether there's deep recesses or not, you want to use a big fat makeup brush for this kind of thing because you're only going to be trying to touch the raised parts. So it makes more sense. You're not trying to get down into the little skinny panels. You're trying to just get it in the raised parts. And in this situation, I used a Pro Acryl paint, which you can see here, and it's just a light kind of neutral gray. And then I put it on there, dry brush, wipe most of it off again, and then just start to catch the tops and the edges, and I'm brushing down but not back up again. And the reason for that is because I want this lighter colored paint to catch on the raised parts, the higher parts where the sun would be coming down from the sky, but not get into the undercuts where the shadows should be, and I'm going to work that direction. I'm also going to try to not get this color along the bottom part of the model, of the terrain piece. As a building gets closer to the ground, it has a tendency to get darker. Very frequently because of, I don't know, probably sun bleaching. If it's a building that's in not surrounded by concrete, but surrounded by, say, dirt or soil, then it's frequently water coming off the roof, splashing, mud coming up, hitting the side of the building. You've seen that kind of look before. So generally I try to keep these highlights high on the model and keep them up higher, get towards the top and all that kind of stuff. And again, it's a very fast process just using the makeup brush to get this lighter color to hit all the raised parts. And then at this point, honestly, if you wanted to stop, you totally could. This step is not a necessity, but what I then like to do is take, again, a smaller makeup brush, big fluffy makeup brush. I've done a video about makeup brushes if you haven't seen it. Pachow. They will change your life for dry brushing, seriously. But the smaller dry brush at this point now, you're going to take it and try to find yourself like a color that is maybe a warmer color. I used this color from the Army Painter for this step, and skeleton bone. And in this situation, I just basically went along the tops again, but just in little spots. I didn't do the whole model. I just did it in certain little spots to try to add in a little bit of a color variation to the highlight, so it's not all just one tone. We don't want to make the thing look monochrome particularly. We just don't, in my opinion, want it to stand out and overpower the models that are standing near it. So you kind of get some color, in there to make it a little bit of dirt, a little bit of whatever, but it fools the eyes and makes it look like it has a little bit more color depth to it. So again, small brush, do it in little areas, and a little bit of a warmer color to go against that original neutral gray for the highlight. And, that, again, you don't have to do it that way, but I like to do it, and it's a pretty quick step. Now, sometimes you want to dry brush in one area that bumps right up against another area, and you don't want to get dry brush in that area, so what do? Well, in this situation, I wanted the floor on this building, the ruined floor, to look like it had been metallic, preferably actually almost like a brass. But it was real grungy now, and I didn't want to get any of the gray from the walls onto the brass kind of floor, and I didn't want to get any of the brass from the floor onto the walls. So I just used Post-it notes. Post-it notes can be, in a pinch, a great masking thing. I could take out masking tape and lay it all out and do all that stuff, or I could just quickly lay down some Post-it notes, do some dry brushing, pick them up, flip them around, stick them on the wall, do some other dry brushing on the floor, and boom, done. We're not concerned about overspray. We're not concerned about an excess of paint. We're just trying to protect one area from the other so that you can have these two dry brush areas, which frequently it's very difficult to control, especially if you're using a big dry brush, control where it goes. And that's kind of the point in some degree because it gives this sort of more natural overall look. But when you want this big dry brush area to be very different from that one, you either end up having to build the model in sub-assemblies, which nobody wants to do for terrain, at least in my opinion, or you just lay down some Post-it notes. Get some, they're at the grocery store. You can get them anywhere. And then just use that to dry brush as a mask in certain areas so you don't get stuff in other areas. I even use Post-it notes sometimes with airbrushing, but you got to be a little bit more careful. And again, at this point, you could stop. It's pretty much done. But If you wanted to, you could also add some little embellishments. Again, so much of this terrain these days has got so much detail, especially the 40K stuff from Games Workshop. They have to put in a ton of detail to really give some visual interest to the terrain. The thing is that you don't have to paint it all. If you look at a building, generally, like go outside, well, not while you're watching this, but afterwards, look at a building and you might see conduits and piping and stuff all over the outside of the building. They frequently paint it the same color of the building so that it doesn't stand out, right? So having to go through on each one of these little pipes and wires and brackets and stuff like that, well, the brackets I have to paint metal and the wires I have to paint, black or red or whatever. You can do that, don't get me wrong. But generally, that's not the way it works in the real world. And again, it's going to draw your eye a lot more to the terrain and a little bit less from your models. So throw a little bit of wash in some spots. Like if you find some panel areas, you can very quickly throw some wash in those panel areas to make them look a little bit different. If you're painting like stone stuff, for like Warcry or any other kind of fantasy style game, I like to take wash towards the end and just make some of the stones a slightly different color by throwing on either a sepia or a brown or a black wash. That then makes it look like that stone doesn't match the rest of them. It was brought in, set down, whatever, but it just gives a visual interest so not everything is so samey. A little bit of that can help. Some contrast paint or some glazes, if you want to go through and color some little things here and there, it will keep them still within the overall visual palette of the overall building, but it will still allow you to be able to pop some things a little bit here and there as far as visually. If you want to go through and put rust or some other kind of weathering on the building, you can. Again, that's a further down the road thing. And even I'm not usually generally going to do that too much. Depends on the building. If the building has like reinforced like metal corners on it or something like that, I might try to throw some rust on those. But otherwise, I'm not going to generally do that. You can even go through and put in some dry brush silver in certain spots. Like I put that dry brush brass on the floor, and that's just because I wanted that was the inside of the building, and it makes more sense that the inside of the building would frequently be a little bit different than the outside of the building. So keep that in mind as well. Terrain only takes as long as you want it to take. And again, I think it's a very important thing to think about when you're painting your terrain that number one, if you paint it really crazy, tons and tons of crazy colors and do all kinds of stuff and just spend all this time on it, you're doing two things that are probably not great for your models. Number one, you are spending more time on terrain and less time on models. And number two, you are making your terrain stand out even more on the table from your models, and then your models are no longer the stars of the show, which really generally they should be. If you're painting terrain for cool photos and stuff like that, yeah, knock yourself out. And I'm not going to tell you in any situation what you shouldn't do. I'm just telling you, if you're looking to get some things done, this is a quick and easy way to do it and get more terrain on your table, have it not take away too much from your models, and just make the overall experience look a lot nicer.